Last year, I played the new Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles game, Shredder's Revenge. It is, to put it in appropriate language, radical to the max, dude. It's a side-scrolling beat-em-up that I can happily put alongside other recent-ish throwback brawlers like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Streets of Rage 4, games that collectively bring back a genre that largely thrived in the 1990s and then disappeared. These games keep the concept as faithful as possible, while also bringing in some refined modern sensibilities that make them an absolute blast to play. Shredder's Revenge is nostalgic in a second way though, as it's specifically based on the original Turtles cartoon show that ran from 1987 to 1996, even going as far as casting the original voice actors for the world's most fearsome fighting team. And as someone who was totally into the cartoon as a kid and hasn't really engaged with the franchise since, it was a rush of nostalgia to re-engage with it in this way. Now you may be wondering why I'm praising the latest Turtles game in a video that claims to be about censorship, because there's an extra layer attached to the nostalgia of the game for those of us in the UK, and that's the fact that the cartoon initially wasn't called Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles over here, and it's all the fault of one man. This is James Furman, who from 1975 to 1999 served as director of the British Board of Film Classification, or the BBFC. They're the organisation responsible for slapping those age ratings on every movie released here, much like the MPA do in America. And during Furman's time as director, the BBFC waged war on ninjas, and it's all Bruce Lee's fault. You see, Enter the Dragon, aside from being an excellent movie, was also a moral dilemma for the UK. After all, that one scene where Lee takes on a bunch of dudes with a set of nunchucks was obviously going to lead British youth down a terrible path, and schoolyards were going to be full of nunchuck-related violence, and the authorities were going to be utterly helpless to stop it. So Furman knew he had to do something. So he banned any movie or TV show releasing in the UK from utilising nunchucks. But it didn't stop there. Other weapons were also deemed questionable, including the Bowie knife, the shuriken, and knuckle dusters. Also, the entire concept of a ninja was just right out. Just so we're clear, the BBFC did approve David Cronenberg's Crash, a movie about people who experience sexual pleasure from car crashes with no cuts. But God forbid you show ancient Japanese assassination arts, because that's a step too far. So, when American producers brought a hot new cartoon over in the early 90s, there was a problem. Because not only did it have ninja in the title, but one of its main characters prominently used nunchucks. Changes had to be made, including changing the name of the show to Teenage Mutant Hero Turtles, and then awkwardly re-editing every single episode to avoid showing Michelangelo using his weapon. The UK title sequence is a sloppy 11th hour mess, clearly done to appease the BBFC, where the title has been re-sung, but the line about Splinter teaching the Turtles to be ninja teens awkwardly edits the word fighting from elsewhere in the theme, to the point where you can still just about hear the N of ninja, so it's sort of like he's saying fighting. And every shot of Mikey has been plastered over with random shots from the show and an uncomfortably long freeze frame when the show's logo shows up at the beginning. This extended to the movies too, as the second movie that released in the 90s forbid Mikey from using sausages as nunchucks. And no, none of the other turtles suffered a similar fate. Not even Leo and his swords, which honestly is kind of a worse weapon. If this sounds absurd, then you're in good company, because other members of the board wildly disagreed with Furman's decision, including Richard Falcon, not related to the captain, who'd received complaints from his nephews, and another unnamed examiner whose daughter had managed to see the uncensored American version of the first film, and it hadn't led her to commit any nunchuck-related violence that we know of. Even when this specific point was made to Furman, the copycat violence simply wasn't an issue. He insisted that this was proof of the success of his policy. He stepped down from the board in 1999 and then passed away in 2002, where a series of obituaries looked back on the baffling decisions that marked his career. And with his death, the policy died too, and re-releases of TMNT in the UK have imported the US version instead, and Shredder's Revenge was able to release in 2022 with the franchise's normal title. But for that decade of the franchise's life, British kids had to live without ninjutsu, or Mikey having a weapon, in what is one of the weirdest bits of censorship to have ever occurred. So I just spent a lot of time talking about a cartoon from the 90s on what is ostensibly a video game channel. Why? Well, because playing Shredder's Revenge reminded me of that bizarre censorship, and led me down a rabbit hole of censorship around nerdy media, including video games, and I decided I wanted to explore it and see what value, if anything, censorship brings to the video game market. What do I mean by censorship? Basically, anything that could be justifiably referred to in that way. Cuts made to a work by a ratings board, a publisher, a platform, or even at a governmental level. As a content creator, I'm also intensely aware of another kind of censorship, YouTube's monetization check, so it's going to be fun dancing around some of the subjects in this video to avoid getting demonetized. Feel free to donate to me on Patreon, that might help. There's a lot of debate surrounding censorship. How necessary is it? What purpose does it serve? Can it be dangerous? Or is it all just a bit silly? This isn't complaining about moral standards. Instead, it's going to be a general overview of censorship, ratings boards, and the reaction these things cause within video games. It's looking at it from a somewhat objective standpoint, although obviously I have my own biases that will inevitably shape where this goes. I'm Bob the Pet Ferret, and it's time to look into the weird world of video game censorship. And if you appreciate what I do here, make sure to like and subscribe. And like I said, support on Patreon would really help in case things do get demonetized. So now, let's go back and look at when the discussion around video game censorship first started. Let's go back to 1982 and the Atari 2600, an important console in the history of video games, but ultimately a messy one too. After all, some of Atari's decisions almost led to the entire American games industry collapsing in on itself, so that's kind of impressive in its awfulness. And one principal problem with the console was a lack of quality control for anything releasing on the system, which is why something like Custer's Revenge was even allowed to exist. If you haven't heard of this game, you play as General George Armstrong Custer, the American cavalry commander who died at the Battle of Little Bighorn. Only now, he's here for revenge, specifically using his Little Bighorn, which is permanently on full display, flopping around as he walks. You may have also noticed the native woman tied up on the side of the screen, and if you're worried that this naked man's intentions with this captive naked woman might not be honourable, you are sadly correct. The objective is to cross the screen so that you can have your revenge. Sounds wildly offensive? Oh, it was. It was also notoriously a bad game, generally considered one of the worst video games ever made. And you better believe that it attracted criticism from a combination of Native American and women's rights groups at the time, who claimed it promoted non-consensual acts of romance? Look, YouTube are watching me like a hawk here, I've got to be careful how I put this stuff. The game's creator, Joel Miller, refuted the claim that the game was misogynistic, saying that the unnamed native woman was a willing participant. Sure she is. Whatever you say, Joel. It got banned in Suffolk County, New York. It got banned in LA. It got called distasteful in Oklahoma. Even Atari figured this might not be good for them and ultimately sued the developer Mystique in an attempt to block the sale of the game, which I think sums up the level of their quality control at the time. You shouldn't need to involve the courts in this. But video game controversy didn't stop there. Quality control mechanisms for later systems prevented games like Custer's Revenge from happening again, but the medium found new ways to shock and appall. 1992 brought two games so shocking and offensive to the market that the US Senate called on the video game industry to explain themselves. One of the games was a brutally violent game about murder, while the other was a sexually exploitative game with heavily realistic visuals. Those games were Mortal Kombat and Night Trap. Mortal Kombat was, of course, the first in the popular fighting game franchise where characters could battle to the death in gruesome ways. Clearly, this was going to cause an epidemic of children ripping each other's spines out or exploding each other into a suspiciously large number of rib cages. A problem that's only going to persist with the series that's still going, now with X-ray shots and actual high-definition visuals. Oh yeah, look at that I mean, how terrible. Night Trap, meanwhile, had the player protect a sleepover full of innocent young women who were getting invaded by vampires, or at least that's what the game calls them, I'm not really sure. As well as all the mild B-movie quality violence, it was possible to eavesdrop on the women talking in their underwear. Shocking, really. Both of these games featured realistic visuals, and by that I mean one had digitally scanned actors as sprites, while the other was an FMV game. And of course, seeing real actors getting their spines ripped out and innocent women getting threatened and even killed was too much. and the Senate got involved. They weren't too pleased with the industry's lack of consistent effort to protect minors from violent content, and demanded they do something about it, or else they would step in. And rather than let a bunch of politicians who barely knew what a Nintendo was take charge, it led to the formation of the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, or the ESRB, in 1994, whose job today is to assess the content of video games and slap a big letter on the front of the box to indicate who the game is suitable for. The ratings are E for everyone, E10 plus for everyone over 10 years old, T for teens, M for anyone over 18, and the rare AO rating, which is basically just pornography. Some of the few games to get this last rating include Wet the Sexy Empire, Playboy Screensaver, and Water Closet the Forbidden Chamber. All classics, I'm sure you agree. But it wasn't the only software ratings board to emerge. Here in the UK, the European Leisure Software Publishers Association, or ELSPA, set up a ratings board that used to appear on the back of game boxes. Separately, a gutter press-driven campaign was launched to tackle the moral dilemma of the 80s. Violent content released on VHS, which at the time we deemed video nasties because we had the mentality of 6-year-olds. This led to the formation of the Video Standards Council, a body designed to stamp out obscenity, a term that came with little definition. And while it initially acted as the lapdog for moral crusaders, it has since shifted to become the ratings board for video games in the UK. It feeds its findings into a European-wide organisation, the Interactive Software Federation of Europe, so that Europe as a region can have a single rating applied to it while still respecting the individual sensibilities of each nation. That rating is known as the Pan-European Game Information, or PEGI for short, and that's what you'll see on European game boxes today. And unlike the ESRB's odd letter-based system, we use numbers to simply represent the suitable minimum age for that game. 3, 7, 12, 16, 18, and everyone's favourite age, the exclamation mark. PEGI also provide useful symbols on the back of the box representing the type of content to be wary of, such as violence, bad language, sex, and my personal favourite, fear, which you need to be especially wary of on the PS5. Also, unlike the ESRB ratings, PEGI ratings are legally enforceable in the UK, meaning it is officially illegal for any game shop to sell an 18 rated game to a minor. Unofficially, things do slip through the net, but that's beside the point. But for a time, someone else was involved in the rating of games in the UK.
Down with this sort of thing! Careful now.
Remember the BBFC? Yeah, the guys who really didn't like ninjas? Well, for a while they acted as a secondary arbiter for any games releasing in the UK. Initially they were brought in if games contained a certain level of controversial content, violence, sex, language, etc. This role was expanded to briefly rating all games released in the UK alongside the VSC. Does that sound pointless? It's because it was, which is why our adoption of the PEGI system completely removed the BBFC from the equation. But with the BBFC being a little more ban-heavy and their established disdain for Japanese assassins, surely this meant that a lot of games got banned during the years. That's definitely the story, so let's take a look at some of the more notable victims of the BBFC's really harsh bans. In the mid-90s, a little Scottish developer was riding high off the success of a puzzle game called Lemmings, and they were doing what they could to find their next hit. After multiple projects working with Nintendo that didn't really take off, they'd soon find their next success in a game called Race and Chase. In this top-down driving game, players could choose between cops and robbers, with the cops having to stop the robbers while the robbers tried to escape. There was just one problem. In playtesting, no one wanted to play as the cops, so they decided to change the concept and turn it into a game entirely about being a criminal. They kept the driving mechanics, and stealing cars became such a major mechanic of the game that it would become the new name for the project: Grand Theft Auto. It looks primitive now compared to later entries in the series, but this game would generate a significant amount of controversy in the UK at the time. The game was accused of promoting criminal behaviour, rewarding players for being a right bastard. "Imagine the effect this might have on our impressionable youth," cried the government. Lord Campbell of Croy asked in a parliamentary debate, "Is it true, as reported, that the game includes thefts of cars, joyriding, hit-and-run accidents, and being chased by the police, and that there would be nothing to stop children from buying it? To use current terminology, is that not off-message for young people?" There were also questions about whether or not it was lawful to sell to children in the UK. A cavalcade of press and political hand-wringing over the appropriateness of the game erupted, which meant the game released in a flurry of controversy and outrage. Thing is, all of it was manufactured. I mean, yeah, the Daily Mail were almost certainly genuine in their outrage, because that's just their whole MO. but this reaction was expected and maximum attention was given to those most likely to have this reaction. All of it was orchestrated by this man, Max Clifford, a sleazy PR man who was notorious in the UK for his manufactured controversies and lack of moral code. Clifford's work rose to prominence when he attempted to elevate the reputation of comedian Freddie Starr by promoting a story that he ate someone's hamster. He would later expose the clients of a high-class prostitute, made a celebrity out of a famous footballer's alleged mistress, and represented O.J. Simpson during his murder trial. He would later be convicted of crimes that I can't really discuss on YouTube, but let's just say his victims were girls and young women between the ages of 15 and 19. I'm sure you can fill in the blanks. He would go on to die in prison. This was a good outcome. David Jones and Mike Daly, creators of the original GTA, hired Clifford because of this ability to turn sleaze into success, and generated a controversy, making it look like a ban on the game might happen. This led to a huge wave of interest as players wanted to see what all the fuss was about. And now, Grand Theft Auto is one of the biggest franchises in the industry, with GTA 5 being the biggest entertainment product in history by itself. But despite all the calls for the games to be banned, it never was. Lord Campbell's concerns over the BBFC not classifying the game came not from them refusing, but simply not having gotten around to it. And when they did, they handed the game an 18 rating, effectively banning it for sale to children, but not for adults. Oh, okay, let's talk about Thrill Kill. That's a game that was never released due to its content, so let's talk about that. It was a 4-player fighting game, one of the first of its kind for the PlayStation, and according to its producer during previews, it's a game that doesn't intend to apologise to anything, to anyone, and that the team wanted players married to Street Fighter or Tekken to turn Thrill Kill into their mistress. You know, classy stuff. The game itself boasted a BDSM aesthetic, all leather straps, high heels, whips and creepy psychosexual imagery. This was deliberate, designed to whip up controversy and gain attention in the same way that Mortal Kombat and Grand Theft Auto had managed, and it worked as the BBFC never gave it a rating and subsequently it never released in the UK. Because the game was never finished. You see, during development, Virgin Interactive, the least appropriately named publisher for a game so fixated on BDSM, went under. During the fire sale of assets, EA gained a bunch of their IPs, including Thrill Kill, and EA simply didn't like the game and didn't want to support its completion and release. It may not even have been the BDSM aspect, despite some developer protests. It may have been simply that the game wasn't very good. Basically, the whole thing ended up appearing to be a mediocre game, drumming up attention for itself by playing itself up as controversial. Oh, okay, no, let's talk about Rule of Rose. That had to have been actually banned by the BBFC, right? After all, that game never released in the UK, but it did release in the rest of Europe, so there's clearly a story there. Rule of Rose was a survival horror game set in an orphanage and focus on a group of immoral horror children. Fairly standard horror trope then, except this game attracted controversy across Europe for scenes of brutality against children and even, cover your ears YouTube, underage eroticism. Or at least that's what the game contained if you believed a motion submitted to the European Parliament by Italian politician Franco Frattini. According to the motion, the game contained violent and sadistic images that are harmful to human dignity and called for a ban on all violent and cruel video games. The British press followed suit because, of course they did, because if they stopped manufacturing outrage for once, they might actually have to do some real journalism. According to the Times, the game contained alleged overtones of lesbianism and sadomasochism, and the word alleged is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, as none of this is true, as the Video Standards Council pointed out to them at the time. However, publisher 505 Games got scared and simply decided to not release it in the UK and avoid the wrath of the press. Because, you know, you have to respect a media that blamed the victims of Hillsborough for their own deaths, hacked the phones of innocent citizens, and killed a princess. You know, respectable institution. But that clearly wasn't an actual ban. It was a publisher panicking over possible backlash. That publisher would go on to release Control, so I guess we can forgive them. So did the BBFC actually ban anything? Wait, no, I do have one. This is a good one. Manhunt. It's Rockstar, again, because they learned from the outrage with literally every GTA that controversy nets them sales. So they made Manhunt, a game about brutal killers brutally killing each other in a brutal game of survival by killing. It involved a lot of brutal killing, in case this wasn't clear. A dystopian tale about a society that welcomes Saw-like violence as a way to tackle crime. And naturally, it did court controversy. Once again, the press got outraged and it got dangerously close to being banned. And then it didn't. But its sequel did. Manhunt 2 ramped up the brutality and torture, and the ESRB in America felt it was only suitable for an adults-only rating, meaning they couldn't sell it on any console made by Sony, Microsoft, or Nintendo, so you know, all of them. The BBFC meanwhile simply refused classification, effectively banning it. The issue mostly revolved around the game's execution scenes, which were visceral and graphic, and both ratings boards felt uncomfortable with them. Rockstar decided to censor the game, making the executions more stylized with color filters and blurring and toning some of the killings down, leaving the game with exactly 2 decapitations, which apparently is the normal number of decapitations, because that's what led both ratings board to give the game an M and an 18 respectively. So it was banned, just not permanently. Obviously there are discussions to be had about whether that initial banning was necessary, and whether or not the issues around depravity were overreaching, but it does stand out as one of the few times the UK ratings board has outright refused a classification for a game. And in most high profile cases where a game has attracted controversy, the BBFC and the VSC both happily approved it without too much issue, simply saying it's a game for adults that legally can't be sold to children, and that's fine. It in fact says more about those generating the controversy than it does about ratings boards, who mostly seem to make decisions based on rational factors, and are more concerned with customers making informed choices more than removing controversial titles from sale. So perhaps we should examine the moral crusaders instead. In fact, let's stick with Manhunt and take a look at a legal case that emerged around it. And more importantly, let's look at the lawyer behind it. In 2004, 14-year-old Stefan Pekira was murdered by his friend Warren LeBlanc, aged 17, in Leicestershire, UK. Very quickly, the case attracted a lot of media attention because reports claimed that LeBlanc was obsessed with the game Manhunt, and that the murder was his attempt to recreate the killings within the game. Much was made of this as discussion broke out about the damage that violent video games were having on the youth. The game was voluntarily withdrawn from sale in places like Game and Dixon's, and there were concerns that the game could face a full ban. Pekira's family took Rockstar and Sony to court for publishing and distributing such a dangerous work, hiring a hotshot lawyer from America to argue their case. However, the police soon clarified that the press were wrong. LeBlanc was not committing a copycat murder he learned from a video game, it was a dispute over drugs. And in a surprise twist, they confirmed that the copy of Manhunt that was found did not belong to the killer, it belonged to the victim. The case was dropped, sole responsibility fell onto LeBlanc, who was sentenced to life, and the hotshot lawyer was furious. It's not surprising either, as this particular hotshot lawyer was on a crusade to take down video games. His name was Jack Thompson. If you were engaged with gaming discourse online in the 2000s, you probably recognise that name, as he was a major thorn in the side of the video games industry for much of that decade. He was mocked in webcomics and quietly cursed out in developer offices around the world. Jack Thompson, originally from Ohio, but practiced law out of the usually totally sane state of Florida, initially started his career by taking to take down rap music for its corrupting influence on the youth of America. He mostly focused on 2 Live Crew, Ice-T, and Madonna. Eventually he got bored of this and turned his attention to video games. He claimed that all school shooters were found to be gamers, and said that he'd read scientific studies that found teenage brain chemistry is especially susceptible to copycat behaviour after playing video games, and that the vibrations of the DualShock controller were designed to train you to enjoy killing. He did not cite any sources for these claims. His first prominent case against video games came after the 1997 Health High School shooting, as the perpetrator had regularly played video games such as Doom, Resident Evil, and Nightmare Creatures. Well, that's a deep cut. Okay. Anyway, Thompson launched a lawsuit against the publishers of these games, seeking $33 million in damages for victims' families, and also weirdly decided to place blame on pornography and the movie Basketball Diaries as well for some reason. The case was thrown out, citing a lack of legally recognisable claims, possibly because he kept piling every piece of media he personally disliked into the mix for some reason. He would then launch 5 cases specifically against Rockstar over Grand Theft Auto, each one filed in a different state. In Ohio, he bafflingly tried to work both sides of a murder case where a 16-year-old boy had killed a teenage girl, allegedly due to the boy's obsession with GTA 3. In Tennessee, Thompson attempted to sue Take-Two, Sony and Walmart for providing two violent teenage boys with inspiration for their various crimes. In Alabama, his lawsuit on behalf of the victims of Devon Moore fell apart when his right to open a case in the state was in question when he harassed the opposing attorneys. In New Mexico, he badgered the attorneys of teenage killer Cody Posey to emphasize how much he loved GTA Vice City and how it taught him to shoot. His one successful attempt to take down Rockstar came when he sued Best Buy in Florida for supposedly allowing a sale of Vice City to his 10-year-old son. Best Buy did in fact agree to start enforcing age ratings, which is fair. He also sued Rockstar over Bully for allegedly encouraging bullying in schools, to which the publisher actively brought a copy of the game to court for the judge to review. After the judge felt the game was in fact suitable for release, Thompson insulted the judge, leading to a contempt of court motion and a complaint from the judge sent to the Florida bar. Thompson also wrote to the ESRB around this time to inform them that there was homosexual content in Bully, to which they politely wrote back, "Yes, we know. We rated the game." His lawsuits against Rockstar got so over the top that parent company Take-Two eventually got sick of him, and in 2007 they launched a counter lawsuit against him for harassment. Thompson, much like a supervillain, boasted about how they fell right into his trap, that this is what he wanted them to do, and he couldn't wait to take them to court and destroy them forever, finally fulfilling his ultimate goal. A month later, Thompson settled with Take-Two, agreeing not to launch any further lawsuits against the company and to avoid seeking any legal restrictions against sales of their games. If Thompson sounds absurdly unhinged, it's because he was. During his rap music crusade, he kept bizarrely attacking the US Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, constantly calling her a lesbian and suing her for battery when she clapped back by insulting his manhood. Also around this time, he wore a Batman watch because he declared himself to be exactly like the DC superhero, taking down criminal scum and enacting his own brand of justice. And he called Sony allowing 18-rated games to be released on the PS2 as Pearl Harbor 2, because sure, okay, whatever. His most notorious act was a modest video game proposal, where he issued a challenge to the games industry to make a game about killing Paul Eibler, the CEO of Take-Two at the time. The idea was that the games industry was too scared to do this, because they wouldn't dare make a game training kids to kill them. But if a developer did have the balls to do this, he would donate $10,000 to a charity of Eibler's choice. Two games were produced: Defamation of Character, a Jack Thompson murder simulator, where Thompson himself was the main character who goes on a killing spree, and the more well-known I'm Okay, a murder simulator, which more directly met Thompson's requirements. Despite the game doing exactly what he asked, Thompson failed to uphold his end of the bargain. This prompted Penny Arcade to donate the money on his behalf to a charitable arm of the ESA. This angered him further and led to him issuing a ton of criminal complaints against Penny Arcade. The police acknowledged these complaints, but took no further action, because no crime had obviously been committed. While he was far from the only moral crusader desperately seeking to take down video games at the time, Thompson's increasingly desperate and unhinged attacks made him a representation of all the misguided calls for video game censorship that have ever existed. He became a significant annoyance to the industry. The president of the Entertainment Consumers Association expressed exasperation over Thompson's constant emails, while the executive director of the Games Developer Association called him an ambulance chaser. He also said that he'd happily agreed to a debate with Thompson discussing the potential damaging effects of video games, but Thompson failed to follow up, despite it being his idea in the first place. Thompson was unsurprisingly disbarred in 2008 due to being questionable in his use of the legal system as a stick to beat anyone that he deemed his enemy. And with him, he largely took the argument that video games are bad for society with him. There are still moral crusaders out there using the evils of video games as their argument for society's ills. You'll usually see them pop up after a school shooting or some other shocking event, loudly denouncing the medium, but the good news is they barely get the airtime anymore. That's not to say there aren't still controversies over content, it's just the origins of these tend to be a little bit closer to home than intentionally ignorant grifters. While most of the ratings boards around the world tend to be fairly lenient with content, there are still things that raise eyebrows from time to time. In compounding this, most platforms and storefronts have terms of service agreements that developers must agree to, and sometimes this is what raises issues of content. The most famous and arguably earliest example of this is the Nintendo Seal of Quality. Invented by Nintendo of America after the video game crash of 1983, it was designed to be a reassurance by Nintendo that they weren't going to repeat the mistakes of Atari in letting any old crap be on their system. Oh, put that Custer's Revenge footage away. After all, the crash happened because Atari flooded the market with poor quality games, don't show it again, and scared customers off. So Nintendo's seal was supposed to indicate that the product met basic quality standards. It didn't mean the game was good, necessarily. This was effectively a check determining if the game was a functional product. Did it load? Does it read the controller? Does it brick the system at any point? That kind of thing. It still exists today, although now it's called certification and is employed not just by Nintendo, but by Sony and Microsoft as well. But Nintendo did sneak in a few checks beyond basic system functionality. In the 80s and 90s, Nintendo of America were determined to present a family-friendly image at all costs. This meant censoring extreme violence, references to drugs and alcohol, sexual content, and even religious references. Some notable examples of Nintendo censorship during this period include the removal of alcohol in Chrono Trigger, adding more clothes to summons and renaming the holy spell to Pearl in Final Fantasy VI, most of the game Top Secret being morphed into Bionic Commando due to Nazi references, and Castlevania constantly having issues depicting crucifixes being used as weapons against Dracula. It's also why the SNES version of Mortal Kombat was so tame compared to the arcade version, which ended up being a significant factor in the Sega Mega Drive catching up to Nintendo, as players wanted the home experience to be much closer to the arcade, and Sega were the ones offering that. It didn't just affect third-party titles either, as plenty of first-party Nintendo titles saw censorship as they moved to the West. Punch-Out saw the box of Vodka Drunkinsky turn into Soda Popinski, Ness stopped being nude in his dreams in Earthbound, and Super Mario Kart of all things saw censorship in the victory animations, as references to champagne in the victory lap were removed during localization. While the formation of the ESRB led Nintendo of America to calm down a little on censorship, they were still making the odd change in the West to some games even as recently as the Wii U. There are a few notable examples of this, the first being Xenoblade Chronicles X, which allowed players to adjust the bust size of a female avatar, a slider that was removed for the Western releases. Another game that faced similar censorship is one that I've talked about recently. Fatal Frame Made in Blackwater saw the removal of 2 unlockable costumes in the Western releases, as they were revealing glamour model outfits. What's interesting is that one of these appears in the story in Japan, but that was also changed in the West, leading to an odd scene where Miyu poses seductively in her normal clothes, even though this scene was supposed to represent her thoughts on being sexualized as a glamour model. In the Western version, it ends up just coming across as a little bit surreal. The recent re-release hasn't brought back these costumes, but it did add some swimsuits, so there's that. All versions still have the baffling jiggle physics though, I'm still complaining about this. Breasts don't work this way, stop it. But one of the more heavily censored Wii U titles was another collaboration. Tokyo Mirage Sessions, a game combining concepts from Atlus's Shin Megami Tensei and Persona franchises, and characters from Fire Emblem. The game depicts the life of pop idols who moonlight as world-saving heroes in a dark alternate world. And because the game features the somewhat seedy world of Japanese pop idols, it leaned into some seediness of its own, with a 17-year-old protagonist who is frequently shown in skimpy outfits. In the Japanese version at least, as the Western version ages her up a year and reduced the skimpiness of her outfit. They even removed her vagina bones! The greatest crime! What's fascinating about this is that only one generation later, Nintendo seems to have completely relaxed their stance, as now they're allowing full-blown hentai games to release on Switch, usually with little to no censorship. PlayStation, meanwhile, have some issues here and there, especially with the infamous scene in Devil May Cry 5 where a naked Trish gets a censor bar lens flare, even though the scene shows basically no real nudity due to careful camera angles. These examples are interesting because there are numerous instances of games having to tone down sexual content from Japan to the West, but when reversed, it's violent content that gets suppressed. There's been a recent example of this, as the intensely gory Callisto Protocol from the producer of Dead Space will not be releasing Japan at all because it's just body parts everywhere. Quite frankly, having played the game, I don't honestly feel like they're missing out on much. It's not a very good game. This kind of censorship has been applied to several Western games thanks to Zero, the Japanese equivalent of PEGI in the ESRB, deeming violent content to be especially bad. The Witcher 3, Cyberpunk 2077, Uncharted, The Last of Us and Grand Theft Auto 5 have all been affected by this. Even Japanese-made games like Resident Evil get more violent Western releases in line with what the devs originally envisioned, while the Japanese version gets cut. Violent connotations are also applied to a seemingly innocuous concept. You know how in cartoons characters usually have 3 fingers and a thumb, largely assumed to be a cost-cutting measure in classic animation studios? Yeah, the Japanese don't like that, and it's either down to a taboo involving factory workers losing fingers in accidents, or the Yakuza punishing people with finger removal. It's not clear which. It's why Crash Bandicoot keeps getting edited in every Japanese release, why Abe lost an extra finger in Oddworld, and why both Ratchet and Psychonauts' Raz have the same number of fingers as a real-life person, as both Ted Price and Tim Schafer detail here.
I also noticed that he has 5 fingers. Is that what? Didn't get into cutscene because his hand? Because that was a big thing with Raz. This was very controversial. We had, like animators like to do. They make 4 or 3.
Okay, yeah.
They make fewer than 5.
Right.
So that's easier because it looks different and it's easier to animate or whatever.
Yep.
And our publisher did not like that. They're like, this is also going to be a big problem in Japan.
Exactly.
They believe that looks like a mutant weird. It's going to be off-putting. It's like.
Well, we always
gross.
heard it was a Yakuza thing.
I wasn't going to bring that up because I don't want to be killed by the Yakuza, but go ahead and tell us, story.
Right, so we always...
This is his story.
This is not necessarily something we were ever told by our friends in Sony. It was that it was this sort of accepted conventional wisdom that if you made characters that had a missing finger, then it implied that they were in trouble with the mob or they were bad because they were missing a finger.
It's caused an interesting dichotomy to emerge where Japan loves sexual content and hates violence, while the reverse is true for America. Effectively, you can beat a guy with his own leg in America and that's fine, but you show the hint of a nipple and the world will collapse. It feels weirdly backwards to me. In Europe it's all over the place, as we largely get what America does, just relocalized just a little bit to reflect more European sensibilities. We're generally okay with sexual content, especially the French, while violent content is just all over the place. In the UK we're especially strange because we're the country of both bawdy Shakespearean humour but also Victorian suppression, so our attitude sits somewhere in the middle. In Germany, you simply cannot talk about Nazis in any context outside of education, and that has led the Wolfenstein series to have a hell of a time releasing there, despite the games being pretty unambiguous about the significant moral failings of the Nazi Party of Germany. It really is a minefield trying to navigate these different sensibilities, and it shows that the concept of censorship in games is always going to be around in some form. We can have debates about the legitimacy of hiding content in certain regions, but ultimately, most of this is minor, or it can be subverted simply by importing from a different region. But there is one case where a developer has seen their work censored due to the requirements of a specific region, but that censorship has ended up applying worldwide. Let's talk about Devotion. In 2017, a Taiwanese studio named Red Candle Games released Detention, a horror point-and-click adventure set in a school. It saw a teenage girl exploring a school haunted by creatures from mythology, and gradually layered in elements of political history, particularly Taiwan's horrific period of martial law from 1949 to 1987. The game received vast amounts of praise at release and even got adapted into a film and a TV series, so anticipation was high for the studio's next game. That game would be Devotion, a game that continued to blend political history with Taiwanese mythology to create a surreal horror experience. It released in 2019 to further praise, but there was a problem. The game was on sale for only a week before it disappeared from Steam. 2 days after release, players found a talisman in the game that referenced an online meme, specifically one that compares Chinese President Xi Jinping to Disney's Winnie the Pooh, which he seemingly hates, as any reference to this gets censored online in China, probably including this video at this point. The problem is, the in-game talisman featured this description, along with a phrase that seemingly said, "Your mother is a moron." The Chinese government were furious, and the game was banned from sale in China and ended up being pulled entirely worldwide. This is despite Red Candle patching the game to change the talisman to a less offensive one that simply read, "Happy New Year," but this wasn't good enough. For almost 2 years, Devotion became unavailable anywhere. Steam would not let it back onto the storefront, and GOG announced that they would pick it up, only to bafflingly retract this mere hours later, citing vague complaints from gamers, which naturally onlookers said was likely just them not wanting to disrupt their business interests in China. During this 2-year period, there was also complete radio silence from Red Candle, with the sole exception of an apology letter that read like a ransom video where the kidnapper is holding a gun to the head of their victim. Red Candle would eventually find a way to set up a store page on their own website, finally bringing the game back to the world, but the whole situation spoke to a wider issue of government censorship within China, an issue that goes way beyond video games. Because China is a huge market and a lot of international companies want a slice of that pie, but in order to do so, they have to meet the demands of the Chinese government, demands which seem to change drastically from day to day. Even now, they are getting more restrictive on the existence of games as a medium in itself, a decision that's led massive megacorps with stake in video games such as NetEase or Tencent to increasingly invest overseas where they can, actually make and release video games. Most of this video has talked about censorship in a variety of ways, but most of what I've covered so far, honestly, is kind of harmless. The ratings boards are run by people who understand the medium, changes made to games are often minor, and no country particularly seems interested in outright banning anything. Even situations such as Rule of Rose, where the publisher simply freaked out, or the Callisto Protocol, where the developer didn't wish to compromise, doesn't scream government censorship. We're even able to openly mock the likes of Jack Thompson, whose efforts to destroy video games succeeded only in destroying his own career. Devotion, on the other hand, is a very different beast. This is a lot more serious. This was a full-scale block on the sales of a game simply because of a single asset that was easily replaced. This wasn't a situation where a ratings board wanted a bit of gore toned down, or maybe some vagina bones needed to be surgically removed. This was government overreach, a type of overreach that is threatening the existence of the entire industry in the country that it occurred. I can even name an equivalent situation in the UK to show the contrast. Not Tonight, a satirical management game set in a post-Brexit Britain, hasn't been censored by the UK government, likely because the Tories are too busy ignoring their own rules, crashing our economy through the floor, or appointing a national security risk to be in charge of national security. And since I wrote this script, I can't even begin to talk about the ridiculous scandals they've been doing. And that's not a game where a single asset could be simply replaced at the request of a tyrannical government. The entire game is about Brexit. You literally cannot remove that element from the game without simply removing the game from existence. Don't get me wrong, this government would almost certainly love to censor things to the degree that China is, but there's no interest in completely censoring video games here. Hell, the games industry continues to get tax breaks here to encourage its growth. I see a lot of fuss online about how bad it is that a titty got covered up, or that Scorpion doesn't fully eviscerate his opponent on the SNES, but those examples of censorship are mild and forgivable compared to the situation with Devotion. And no, one doesn't automatically lead to the other. Outright banning games globally because one country doesn't like a single asset in that game isn't how censorship should be approached. Is there any actual benefit to censorship in games though? It's hard to say. We can debate the merits of keeping content locked away from people due to sensitive subject matter all day, but here's where I stand on the issue. I'm okay with ratings boards as a form of censorship, largely because they rarely, if ever, do a lot of actual censoring. Instead, they examine and assess the content of games and draw up a list of questionable elements and assign an age rating based on the overall severity of these elements. This age rating and its accompanying content information provides a suitable guide for anyone who wishes to approach these games. Hell, I do this exact same thing every time I upload a video because YouTube needs to know how many times I say fuck because advertisers apparently have a limit. I'm someone who'll play gory games without an issue, and my only real objection to sexual content is when it comes across as tacky, which is sadly a lot of the time. I can point to Bayonetta as an example of it done right. That's how you do sexy games, alright? I also feel that the only words that should see censorship are slurs unless presented in a historical context with a million signs pointing to how use of those words is bad. I'm okay with a story set during the time of slavery to feature obvious villains throwing the N-word around, but any white character was supposed to sympathise with using it in a modern context, should probably be tossed out. But I do have a line, and so too, it seems, does Sony, as an example from last year's shows. Martha is Dead released in February 2022 and attracted controversy upon release when the publisher, Wired Productions, revealed that the physical release of the game for PlayStation would be delayed due to restrictions placed on the game by the platform. There was a lot of knee-jerk reaction to this online, so much so in fact that while trying to simply look up the differences between the censored and uncensored versions of the game, I had to wade through countless clickbaity thumbnails and aggressive Sony as Puritan and evil titles, while not one of these videos actually bothered to do their research into what had actually been censored and why, which was really helpful for me, the one YouTuber who actually tried to research this. Ultimately, there are 4 significant scenes that got censored in this game, and all of them in limited ways. 2 of these scenes are interactive in the uncensored version, while the censored version removes the interactivity. Apart from this, the scenes are largely intact and will only be removed if you voluntarily choose to skip them with an optional warning that pops up on screen. The game, which is about an abusive family in World War II Italy, sees a girl named Julia assume the identity of her sister Martha after she drowns in a lake. This leads to a gruesome dream sequence where Julia carves Martha's face off and wears it over her own. There is also a scene where Julia cuts open Martha's abdomen and removes the dead fetus that was inside her. Both of these scenes are grim, but I personally have no issue with them. Plenty of media has scenes of gore like this, and I feel providing the option of a filter to voluntarily censor these scenes for those who are more squeamish is fine. I do feel that Sony requesting the removal of references to female masturbation be removed to be quite silly. I was unaware that PlayStation's third-party content team was headed by John Kellogg, but here we are. Where I draw the line, however, comes in 2 scenes. They ultimately serve as shock value and not really anything valuable to the game's story. I mean, the 2 other gory scenes can be described the same way, but the context of these remaining scenes is more distressing. Fair warning, I'm going to talk about severe mental health issues now, including acts of self-harm. This is another thing that YouTube doesn't like having discussed much, so expect a lot of talking around things from me. If you had to click on a warning before watching this, that's probably why. You see, most mental health charities issue guidelines for anyone in media choosing to discuss the topics of suicide and self-harm. They are complex topics and can often be depicted in truly harmful ways. These guidelines do not say that these topics should not be discussed in a public setting, more that they need to be handled delicately. Raising awareness about mental health is important, and I'm obviously going to be the first to say this, but there is a way to discuss it that does not cause adverse harm to those experiencing desires to harm themselves. If you've ever heard about a celebrity who has taken their own life and the cause of death is kept largely quiet, this is why. Discussion of methods, glamorization, even the words committed suicide are generally frowned upon. The idea is to avoid leading anyone already experiencing these thoughts to go and act them out. Describing an act of self-harm might be an inspiration to those people. Presenting suicide as a noble act is likely to convince someone who's already battling with those thoughts. These are things that we want to avoid. Martha is Dead wildly ignores these guidelines. One scene abruptly shows a suicide for no apparent reason, while another scene late in the game sees Julia perform an act of self-harm on herself. And because I believe in following these guidelines, I will not be discussing these acts further, nor showing them directly. This is the one area where I feel censorship is somewhat warranted. In my eyes, censorship and ratings are there to reduce harm, and using severe mental health issues as a shocking twist does cause harm. There have been studies on this. It enhances stigma against those who suffer, and it may lead to those who are struggling acting on their worst impulses. What's worse, neither of these scenes, and in fact neither of the other 2 affected scenes, actually provide much narrative value. The face cutting is supposed to be symbolic, which would make sense if the sisters weren't identical twins who have the exact same face. The womb cutting seems to exist as the most gruesome possible reveal that Martha was pregnant at the time of her death. The suicide hallucination at Martha's coffin just abruptly happens with no build-up or explanation. And the final scene of self-harm exists to explain something that the game spends a lot of voiceover explicitly explaining ahead of time, that Julia has mental health issues and has been committed to an asylum. I have no issue with these scenes being cut or toned down, as they don't really serve a wider purpose, and 2 of them, in my opinion, are likely to cause actual harm. I feel the way that Sony effectively forced the developers to handle this is the best option. A warning screen that allows players to skip questionable content, not a full removal. I'd argue the warning screens could be a little less vague, but obviously we're rubbing up against the debate between effectively informing people about content and providing full-blown spoilers, and that's always a fine line to walk. So what have we learnt today? Just like the title of this video game censorship is weird. It's a topic that many have heated opinions on, and it's one that rarely, if ever, can be handled right in everyone's eyes. As I've stated, I feel the best way to handle all this is to offer people choice. Video games are a unique medium in that it's interactive and can now be tailored to so many different playstyles and needs. The idea of being able to hide certain content or allowing a game to run entirely uncut is something entirely alien to mediums such as film. Is something like that antithetical to a developer's vision? I don't believe so. There are so many things we can do in games that aren't explicitly what the developer intended. Anyone who's ever glitched through a wall or discovered an exploit is also kind of going against the developer's vision, but that's always considered fine. Plus, if the right options are included, then surely the developer's vision is for you to tailor the experience to your liking. Censorship is messy, weird, and sadly, somewhat necessary. Adult content does need to be kept away from children who might not be able to mentally process it at their young age. Difficult subjects need to be handled with sensitivity, and maybe we could be a little less creepy when it comes to sexual content. There will never be a right way to handle this kind of thing, but I do think it's best to keep sensible dialogue open at all times. And no, those Sony is Puritan and evil thumbnails are absolutely not sensible dialogue. But what I think we can all agree on in this messy topic is that censoring nunchucks and anything to do with ninjas is absurd.